So, Mini. Believe it or not, a car you and I have never driven together on camera in the 6 years of this show. So as we close out Season 5 in 2015, and before we kick off Season 6, but usher in 2016, let's change that by going to the deep south of Savannah, Georgia, and driving not just any Mini, but a reinvented Mini. And I don't know how to quite put this, but a big Mini. Got it? So in the tech review episode, you and I spent a lot of time talking about the two engines on offer. And I know you guys think three-cylinder engines, well, they're about as tech savvy as the propulsion system of this thing. But here's the thing, if you didn't get the memo, Mini is owned by BMW, and basically they took the 3-liter 6-cylinder from the 3 Series and halved it. That's where you get the 1.5. And really what they did is they threw a lot of technology at it. So remember in the 7 Series we talked about the twin power turbo. Now in this case it is not 2 turbos, but twin power turbo. What it means is a turbocharger paired with variable valve timing, paired with direct injection, and get this, variable lift. So when I talk about 162 pound-feet of torque in the 3-cylinder and 207 pound-feet of torque in the 4-cylinder, it's the variable lift that gets you that torque at 1,250 RPM. Probably a lot better than that. So let's clarify something. Twin power turbo in that 7 Series we drove back in New York, wow, that was pulling power. Twin power turbo here, not exactly fire breathing, but not a disappointment either. Like, the Brits, they have a term for it, sprightly. There's a couple of things going on here. The most important, torque, that comes in at the 1,250 mark, and that's really the benefit of all this twin power turbo branding thing. It's not a huge amount of like neck-breaking pulling power, but for a car in this segment, very strong. The focus here now needs to be on the transmission, because the trend nowadays is to add all these gears to automatic transmissions to increase fuel economy. But in the past, we've had a very good example and we've had a very bad example. Like that Jeep with the 9 gears, terrible. But then we tried a different 9-speed transmission in the Mercedes GLE Coupe and the C450, and that was awesome. But now those were all working with cars that had more power, like in the Mercedes, up to 360 pound-feet of torque. This, the transmission, it needs to work a little bit harder. Like you see if the engineers actually chose the right gear pairings here. So in this case, you put your foot into it, it actually hands off to the right gear at the right time. And you would think with a 4-cylinder where it actually revs a bit higher, the engine would get buzzy and you'd feel the downshift. You don't feel that here with this transmission. So riddle me this, what does designing a Mini have in common with designing, say, a suspension bridge? Here's the thing, when you are designing a suspension bridge, whether it's the Brooklyn Bridge in New York or the Talmadge Bridge here in Savannah that basically is the route out to Hilton Head, you can make all sorts of changes you want, but there are things that have to be, which is 2 towers and a suspended roadway. Granted, this looks very different than John Roebling's original design in New York, but it is still very much a suspension bridge. And designing a Mini is kind of the same thing. We covered this in the tech review a bit. It's gotta be one of the hardest jobs in the world. And it's not just Minis, it's Jerry over at Land Rover and Range Rover, and Michael over at Porsche. All those cars are iconic. They have to look a certain way, otherwise like you and I will go and chase these people down and throw them off said bridge. So I spent some time talking with Christopher, and there are a number of changes in this Mini that looks like a Mini, but there are things, it's kind of like peeling an onion. There are many layers to it. Like for example, there are creases now in the back of a Mini, or if you look really detailed onto the side, there's like these scooped out vents behind the front wheels that go all the way into the door. Something you've never seen on a Mini or a suspension bridge. Okay, so I got another riddle for you. What does design have to do with driving dynamics in this case? Well, you got to look at the front. You notice it's got these vents there, which the other cars don't have. And believe it or not, those are actually functional. So if you look at the vent, the air will go into the vent and then actually goes over the wheel wells. And then that design trick where it's got those air vents, I call them air vents, but MINI calls them air breathers. The air actually comes out of the air breathers on the side of the car, and the whole idea is to lower the coefficient of drag, which would affect fuel economy, thus affecting driving dynamics. Now, there's another piece to this as well, where you can get a model-specific spoiler, and this one is like the fancier one, so it does have the spoiler. Now, there's a couple of other moving parts here, and really the most important, at least to me, are the dampers. Now, the standard cars, they get standard fixed dampers, but you can have adjustable dampers fitted to this thing. If you notice this cool rotary switch here, that really can do two things. Number one, it can go into a sport mode, and if the car isn't fitted with the adjustable dampers, it basically changes the throttle mapping, and in the automatics, the transmission mapping. But in the case of the adjustable dampers, it will also change the dampers. Now, there is an aside, Germans have like multiple ways of doing these things. You can actually go into the sub menu and change like the steering and the transmission separate from the suspension system, but that's like very complicated, so we'll get back to the other side. And if you switch this rotary thing the other way, it goes into eco mode, and what that does, as you can imagine, it really focuses the car on fuel efficiency, but what it does in terms of driving dynamics is it decouples the transmission, so the car will actually coast, kind of like that the Boxster PDK transmission. Okay, that's a whole bunch of technical mumbo jumbo with the switches in just the right place when the moon and the sun are in alignment, but what's the net? And we got to go back to the basics, meaning the coils and the multi-link. And what that translates to is virtually no body roll in the rear. Now, you do get some lean. I've been pushing this thing pretty hard for the roads in and around Savannah, granted not the California canyons, but generally have felt a good amount of lean when you push really, really, really hard. There's a thing we got to focus on here, and that's the weight. This is anywhere between 3,075 pounds all the way up to about 3,300, depending on how the thing is equipped. But that brings up actually a visual trick. Like, you see this thing in pictures, like you guys are looking at this thing in video, and you're like, oh, that's actually a pretty big car for a Mini. But in reality, the visual trick is look at the roof. It actually sits lower than most cars of its size. Then look at how like the hood bows out. But then most importantly, look at the back where you got the bit that makes a Clubman, which are those horizontal lines. The actual backlight itself, which is vertical, and then the door handles. That horizontal line combined with a lower roof line makes this thing look very long, which in turn makes it look very big. But the reality is, it's actually shorter than a Volkswagen Golf, granted by only a few millimeters. So, British charm. It doesn't necessarily end at the exterior, it extends to the interior. And let's just say in this case, the Germans, they threw a hell of a lot of British charm into this thing. Like, for example, the seats. They don't have their usual mininess to them. In fact, they're more like a Bentley-ness, if I'm really being honest. Like, look at the stitch pattern. It's more of a diamond quilt than the usual lines you see in other Minis. And then there's just an overall change in color and trim, and it's just the textures to a point where you're not looking at charm, you're looking at maturity, which you don't really expect in a Mini, and it's kind of pleasant. Anyway, how does all that combine with the toggle switches, and frankly, those are the things I like about Minis, how does that translate to using them on the road? So I remember back in the day when Minis were first reintroduced by BMW, and the thing I was really taken with was how you could customize them. Like, you could get the Union Jack on the roof or on the mirror fairings, that kind of stuff. But here they've kind of taken it to a different level, I would argue a more mature level, and there's three specific instances. Number one is the lighting. Like, before you even get in the car, on the door, when you open the door, there is a Mini logo that is shot out from underneath the mirror. So it's a puddle light, but with a Mini winged logo. And we've seen this in other cars. We've seen this in Mercedes and stuff like that. But this is a Mini, so it's kind of funny to see that. Another one outside the car, you don't really notice it that often, is the shark fin for the radio aerial. They actually have an LED status light for the alarm in the shark fin. Now that's pretty cool. Not customizable, but very cool. Then on the inside of the car, if you notice, there are these like LED thing around the traditional Mini center gauge thing. And just a little history there, the whole reason they actually built the gauge in the center of the car, like way back in my Greek brother Alex days, was to make it very easy to manufacture. You didn't have to make one for right hook or left hook. Anyway, I digress. But this light thing is kind of reconfigured for stuff like the telephone, some of the audio stuff, and that's part of what they call it the excitement package. I don't know who the hell comes up with these names, but anyway. And then the third thing, and I would call this one customizable, but more, and this is the mature part, like the car we're driving, it has a blue interior. Like, how many cars do you see with blue interiors? I remember back in the day, Derek Jenkins, I remember we built those 4 SEMA show cars for Mazda. Derek Jenkins and I chatted about how no dealers, at least in the US, order cars with any other color interior except for like black and brown. And I gotta take my hat off to Mini's color and trim people actually going with the blue, but not just the blue, but blue with the diamond stitch. And it completely transforms the interior of this car. And it's, I guess, kind of the reason why we chose to drive this one, because it's purple with a blue interior. If that is not customizable, I don't know what is. Now you can customize other bits on the inside here depending on how you kit out your Mini. Like, for example, you can actually get power seats in a Mini. You can also switch out the stereo. And just as an aside about the stereo, I know I could go on and on and on about very fancy stereos in very expensive cars, but I got some exciting news to share. So this is the second to last episode for both 2015 and our season 5. We're starting an all new season 6 in early January, and we're doing it in like big style. We're going to Las Vegas during CES, and I'm going behind the scenes at Bose, you know, the speaker people, and basically going to experiment with them literally live on their Periscope channel. So I'm even going to have some of the engineers to talk to, that kind of stuff, and we'll go and play around with it together. So make sure you follow them on their Bose Periscope channel, but also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and Periscope, and we'll give you all the details and the timings when we're going. But basically going to do it every day, January 6th through January 9th of 2016. And right after that, we're going to start our all-new Season 6 with, I gotta say, some pretty exciting things that we haven't done before. So in summary, what do we got? Well, over the years, I actually have driven a number of Minis, both on-road and on-track, and we've never had a Mini on the show, so they've always been my friends' cars. And they've always been cheap and cheerful. You know what, frankly, not cheap, because you can outfit a Mini kind of any way you want, and they can get pretty pricey, like the one we are driving. But they've always been fun, quick little cars. This was a very different experience for me, because this is a larger vehicle. I think the best way to put it, it is a small family car that is entirely cheerful. But where it deviates from other Minis is it was way more refined. Like, if you spend a lot of time looking at the interior of this thing, the level that they put into it of detailing and some of the color and trim is something you would get out of like a mid-level BMW, not Minis of the past that I have driven. And with that, I want to leave you guys with a question. And this question is going to be a bit different, because usually I ask you about the car in the film. In this case, I want to ask you about your car, and this is for Mini drivers, being that this is our first Mini on the show. What has been your experience in driving a Mini? So, like, do you take it on the track? Is it just a daily driver car? Is it something that you're commuting in? Is it something you do long distance? So, and it's not just the experience of what the car is, but what has been your overall ownership experience? And make sure you let me know what region of the world you live in, and frankly, what Mini you drive. Let me know in the comments below, or via our social media, MotoManTV, all one word, MotoManTV, all one word, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And with that, I want to leave you with 2 things. Number 1, make sure you download our fancy new mobile application, which I had a hand in designing. You can download it for free from iTunes or Google Play. And number 2, this bench, this park, that church, and this is in Savannah. Why is this important in cinematic history? Let me know in the comments below or via social media.